Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbard Gaming. Today I've got my final episode of Utterly Pointless Comparisons for the year, and I'll be taking a look at the arcade and Genesis versions of Galaxy Force 2. Yeah, this one's gonna be pretty interesting. Have a look at the specs of both machines while I tell you just a smidge about the game. Sega released Galaxy Force 2 into the arcades in 1988, and it was pretty much the ultimate superscaler game. It ran on the ultra-powerful Sega Y board, packing three 68,000 CPUs and hardware specifically to scale and rotate sprites. A whole lot of sprites. Galaxy Force 2 was utterly mind-blowing when it was new, and it's still incredibly impressive today. In fact, I highly recommend checking out the 3DS version of this game with the 3D on if you've never done that. Anyway, as a game, Galaxy Force 2, it's alright. It handles great, but it's really pretty simple. The big wrinkle in it is that there are fortresses that you enter, and you have to maneuver the ship around turns and changes in elevation. Overall, it's an amazing experience that absolutely any fan of action video games in general should try for themselves. Now, there was no way that any contemporary home system of the time was going to faithfully reproduce the experience, so the developers of the Genesis/Megadrive Galaxy Force 2 at CRI had their work cut out for them. With no sprite scaling hardware and much more severe sprite and color limitations in general, they focused on trying to recreate as much of the gameplay as they could. And in 1990, they released the Genesis version of the game, and yeah, I won't spoil the surprise, we'll check it out in just a moment now. So relax folks, I know this is quote-unquote an unfair comparison, but the point here is just to see what we got at home on contemporary hardware shortly after the release of the arcade game. I'm in no way suggesting that the Genesis could have done anywhere near a faithful port of Galaxy Force 2. I just want to show you what was actually produced and then discuss how it compares to the original. So recording methodology for this one, I have nothing special to speak of here. I just played the games through. I died once in the arcade game and I kept it in the video, but edited it down to save a few seconds to keep the two games in sync better. So if you think I just always edit out the deaths in these videos, well, you're wrong! Alright, let's get on with it. Okay, and we're underway. There's our planet select screen for the missions, and yeah, it's apparent immediately that there is just no graphical comparison between these two games. And, I mean, you wouldn't expect there to be. Like I said, the arcade hardware that Galaxy Force 2 runs on is vastly superior to the Genesis hardware, and contains lots of special chips for scaling and rotation of sprites. Not only that, it's got three 68,000 CPUs in it. Yeah, this thing was a monster. And, I mean, the graphics in Galaxy Force 2 Arcade are nothing short of absolutely incredible. I mean, this is the height of sprite-based 3D gaming, folks. It doesn't get any better than this. In another world where polygons were never invented for video game purposes, this is what a lot of games might have built their technology on. Now for the Genesis, well, we had an okay looking opening in space even though it was radically scaled down. Once we get inside, the enemy fortresses, that's where things really take a turn for the worse. And they tried to do something, so we've got this nice sort of color cycling pattern, and it does change shapes and everything. It even does sort of include the turns of the arcade game, although they're a lot simpler here. Now, the one thing that I can definitely say is a plus for the Genesis version is it sounds pretty good. The music and sound effects are fairly close to the arcade original. Not quite as close as they could have been, but close. And as we go in to destroy the very first reactor here, or control center, yeah, it looks, kind of like the one in the arcade game. Not exactly, but kind of. Now, as we move on to our second mission, you can see things are going to take a tremendous hit again on Genesis here. And this is one of those points where it's hard to believe you're looking at the same part of the same game. And once we get going, yeah, we've just got a very simple striped pattern on the floor. And for the rest of the game, this is what you're going to be looking at. There's really no other details or anything different except for the very final level. On the arcade, another thing you'll notice is that the ship rotates and the whole screen rotates and tilts whenever you move in any direction. There are parts where it does like a 360 spin sometimes if you get hit really hard. All of that is, of course, completely missing in the Genesis version of the game. And one other thing I'll talk about is controls. For the arcade version, you have throttle controls to go faster and slower. You've got your sort of regular blaster, and then your missiles. For the Genesis version of the game, since it's built to work on standard 3-button Genesis controllers, you sacrifice some of the control. The default control scheme has it so that you fire your main cannons like automatically, and then you manually fire missiles, and you use A and C to speed up and slow down. But here's the thing. In the Genesis version of Galaxy Force 2, there are no points in which you have to slow down. I mean, I am gunning it at top speed for the entire time in both versions of this game. And that's not to show how great I am. You'll see I actually take a death in the arcade one later on. But it's because you kind of have to, or you'll run out of fuel. So, yeah, even at top speed, I never once had to slow down on the Genesis one, even when inside fortresses and taking turns. In the arcade version, you've absolutely got to nail the brakes when you're going around some of these corners, or you will get hit and slam into the walls. And it's a shame they couldn't come up with something a little bit better for the Genesis version of Galaxy Force 2, to simulate textures or things like that. There were some other games that were ported from, advanced hardware where they managed to find something to do in some areas, sort of like the ground in G-Lock, or, just some of the impressive effects that they used later on in Panorama Cotton. So, I mean, the Genesis was capable of doing more than we got in Galaxy Force 2, but, I mean, I understand, why they went the way they did. Now, the next thing you'll see here is on the Genesis version of the game, every reactor or control center looks exactly the same as the one in Level 1. They're just different colors. Meanwhile, in the arcade version, every reactor looks completely different. And here's our first stage where I'd say it takes a really, really major hit, where it's not even recognizable anymore. So in the arcade version, we have this nice little section with water and greenery and waterfalls, and it's really varied scenery. Meanwhile, in the Genesis version, all we get is our striped pattern on the ground. It's really too bad. Again, if they could have just come up with something, some way to simulate maybe even just some texture on the ground, it would have made a real difference here. Now, what I will say is, back in the day, I kind of hated Galaxy Force 2 on the Genesis, and basically every home port of the game. I didn't think any of them were worth playing. But as I went through it this time to do my recording, I played through it a few times, it kind of grew on me a little bit. I mean, there is no circumstance in which I'd rather play the Genesis version than the arcade version, if I had the choice. But, just as a game, I appreciated it a little more this time around than I did in the past. It's still not great, but, I feel like they really did what they could, especially with the cartridge size limitations they had for this one, at the time the game came out. And while the music, is often fairly close to the arcade version, and it's really well done, it could have still been a little bit better. But I'm not going to complain too much. Some of the songs sound very close, and there's my death in the arcade version, by the way. And some of the songs, could have been a little bit better. And here, once again, it doesn't really resemble the arcade version much at all. We don't have any of these things sticking out of the ground like we see. And then in the arcade, we go into this rocky texture area. In the Genesis version, it reuses the waterfall area. The single graphic that they had for the fortress. And you'll see once we get to the fortress, the second fortress in the stage in the arcade version, it's not a waterfall. It's something different. And as we go into this fortress, some of the turns happen at the same time as the arcade version, some of them are a little different. And we lose just a lot of the varied scenery here. Which again, it's just too bad they couldn't come up with something. Because it's not terrible, but it's just really bland, to look at this point. Now, another thing I will point out that I didn't really have an opportunity to yet is the control. So in the arcade, this game uses an analog stick, and the control is super, super fast and smooth. And of course the game runs at 60 frames per second and is very responsive. Meanwhile on Genesis it looks like we're probably running about 20 frames a second. I haven't actually clocked it, but it's definitely below 30. And aside from that, the controls are a lot more sluggish using the digital pad, of the Genesis. And another thing that happens is, in the arcade version, your regular blaster shots are pretty quick. In the Genesis version, they're pretty slow, and it takes them a while to fade out into the distance, and before you can fire again. Likewise with the missile fire. In the arcade version, if you miss, it's not a big deal. You can fire again almost, but not quite instantly. In the Genesis version, if you fire, one of your missiles, and you miss a target, it's quite a while before you can fire another missile. And that really becomes a pain when you're inside fortresses and stuff. And once more, they tried to give us some semblance of something in the Genesis one here. At least they have those little bits of things on the ground, and then we've got our nice hopping robots and everything. But once more, as we go into the enemy fortress, we just get a quick little picture, and then it's right back to the simple color cycling rectangles. This is another one of those games where it really makes you wish that Sega had been able to follow through with their original plan to include scaling and rotation of sprites in the Genesis hardware. If you haven't seen it yet, I've done a video on the Genesis that talks about a whole bunch of facts that you maybe didn't know about it, and that's one of them. And I include links to an interview with the system's designer where he talks about why that chip ended up being cut in the end. Now, if it had the scaling chip, it wouldn't look as good as the arcade version. Obviously, it's not going to have that kind of horsepower still. Didn't have the three, 68,000 CPUs inside it or anything like that. But we would have gotten, something, and it would have been able to, give us something that looked a little bit more akin to the arcade version. Now, the problem, even if they had included the Genesis scaling hardware that they were planning, would have still been the amount of sprites the Genesis can show. So we wouldn't have gotten, an exact replica of the arcade game. We might have been able to get some clouds on this level at least. So there would have been that, for example. And you can see in the arcade version here, we have this big Star Destroyer-like ship that we're flying below. And in the Genesis version, that is just completely omitted. So pretty significant difference there. And you can just see, at almost any point in this game, there's way more going on in the arcade version than the Genesis version. Now, aside from missing the clouds and everything, this level is actually not too far off. But you'll notice, when there's a lot of sprites on the screen here, you will see some flicker in the Genesis one and some things disappear. But they've managed to recreate those long sort of snake-like things pretty well. So props to them for that. As we go in the fortress, once again we just get a simple picture, and then it's on to our color cycling rectangles. I know up to this point I've talked a lot about wanting some semblance of the arcade game in these plain-filled rectangle areas, and in this one at least they do give us the rocks, which helps us kind of recall that we're, in a rocky cave area in the arcade version, so I'm glad they put something in a few of these at least. It's just too bad they didn't put more of these objects in these fortress areas. Don't get me wrong, we see a few minor things here and there on the walls sometimes, but most of the time you don't really get any sense of the same place and feel of the arcade version. And you see right there where it changes color to sort of a sunset sort of look. They actually recreated that on the Genesis, so good on them for that one. Obviously, we're missing the entire structure that we're flying into here. So on Genesis, it's just the plain, stripes on the floor. Then when we get into the enemy fortress, once again, it reuses that picture from a moment ago from the first fortress in the level. And it does throw a bunch of these rocks in here, and it is easy to bump into the tall ones, so you got to be careful to avoid those. And just, we have this huge hangar in the arcade version just loaded with, stationary enemies. In the Genesis version, yeah, I mean, there's lots of things there. They tried to recreate that feel, but it's just much simpler and emptier. And then we do have to go up here a little bit. We get to our control center. Once again, it's the same one in every other level on the Genesis. Meanwhile, in the arcade version, we get something once more that's unique. Alright, and we're almost at the end here, guys. This is the final level. For this level on Genesis, at least we get something that superficially resembles the arcade game. Now in the arcade, we've got a tunnel here with twists and turns. It moves up and down, it moves left and right. On the Genesis, we get sort of a still picture with color cycling. It just doesn't have any level of interactivity like the arcade version does. Again, it would have been unreasonable to expect the Genesis to be able to recreate the effect used in the arcade game, but I can't help but feel that they could have done something a little more, to give you that sense of place, maybe some way of banging into walls or something if you hit it in the wrong way. And this is where things kind of go awry a bit in this level on Genesis. We get this really plain black background with just some scaling columns, and in the arcade version, we've got this complex structure with things you can fly above or below. You've got columns, you've got planks, you've got discs, you've got loads of enemies. There's all kinds of stuff here. And then when we go into the enemy's fortress on this one, we have to blast through the door in the arcade version, and they don't even try to recreate that on Genesis. So once again, we've got our standard looking fortress on the Genesis. They're all the same with the color cycling rectangles. They tried to put those things on the sides of the walls to give you some semblance of what the area is like from the arcade version. So, again, like the last level with the rocks, at least there's something there to help it stand out a little bit. You can see here in the arcade this section's quite a bit longer. And then we get the nice little colorful stuff before we get to the final control center. And hey, that one is actually different on Genesis. They mimicked the same control center graphic as the arcade version. We blow it up, and guess what? We are all done. Our 15-minute long nightmare is finally over. So Galaxy Force 2 on the Genesis, it's really not a terrible game. It's simple, there's not an awful lot to it, but depending on the settings, you can make this a pretty challenging, if not nigh impossible experience on the higher difficulty levels. As it is, they did what they could. As we look at this ending here, it's got mostly the same text, but it's a lot longer on Genesis, because it goes slower, because it's not looking to grab more quarters from you. And then in the arcade version, there's no credits after this, it just goes on to your name entry screen. On the Genesis, we will get a full list of credits afterwards. Also in the arcade version, the ending is silent. There's no music during the ending. On the Genesis version, they did add a new song. So I guess that means the Genesis version's better than the arcade version, huh? Yeah, not quite. While we watch the staff roll, let's maybe talk just a little bit about what they could have done differently with this game. Now, there are other Superscaler-like titles that made their way to the Genesis. Things like Burning Force, some of the areas where you're flying over cities in the Genesis version of G-Lock, and Panorama Cotton. And those games introduce a lot more complex effects than we actually see here in this version of Galaxy Force 2. Yes, it's an early game and the cartridge size is small, and if this had come along a bit later in the Genesis's lifetime, we probably would have got something a bit more impressive. And while I have absolutely no knowledge of any game like this being developed by the homebrew community right now, I'm sure hoping that maybe we'll see something that is done in kind of this style that really shows us what the Genesis was capable of. So there you have it, the arcade and Genesis versions of Galaxy Force 2. CRI managed to recreate some of the core gameplay, but the problem is, arcade Galaxy Force 2 was a thrill ride, a visual tour de force. When you strip away those incredible visuals and bring them down to their bare minimum, what's left isn't exactly all that compelling. Now, like I said earlier, I did enjoy the Genesis version of the game a little more when I played it again to record this video. But there's no universe in which I can imagine anyone would want to play Genesis Galaxy Force 2 instead of the arcade version given the choice. Also, yes, I do know about the FM Towns version of the game, and I've covered it here on the channel before in my video on every Sega game released for that system. I'll link it down in the description and it'll be up here somewhere if you want to check it out. So tell me, did you have the Genesis version of Galaxy Force 2 back in the day? Were you disappointed in it? Did you love the arcade game? Tell me all about it in the comments. And that'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed it, please like it and share it online somewhere. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of my videos. If you want to support the work I do here, you can do that on Patreon, Ko-fi, or through channel memberships here on YouTube now. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.